Hello, this is Ted, and this is day 7 of our boot camp. Today we're going to be going over how to make a website responsive, how to make it react differently to different size screens or different size browsers. We're going to learn a little bit about the basics of flexible box layout, which is a newer feature in CSS. But let's review a little bit about what we went over on Monday first. So we learned that we can center elements horizontally using automatic margins. We learned that we can center elements horizontally and vertically by shifting the element 50% of the parent and then transforming it back 50% of the child's width or height, depending on which way you want to scale it. And then we also learned how to center text, and you can see that right here. Automatic margins, left and right. You can see that we shifted the element and then we transformed it back, and you can see that we centered the text here. And we also went over floats. So whenever we float something, we can float it to the left or the right. And the element's going to be taken out of the normal flow, but it's still going to be in the flow of the document. And this is especially useful whenever we want to have text sort of flowing around an image. And whenever we want things to stop flowing around an image, we just use the clear property. And you can see that from our template that we made last Monday. The left section of our website is floated left, this section is floated right, and then we cleared it then we cleared the float with our footer. So let's go ahead and go on to the flexible box layout. Now, the flexible box layout is actually used throughout the Bootstrap library, something we're going to learn here in a little bit. And it's a whole different way of laying out the document. And whenever we make something use a flexible box layout, all direct children are going to be affected by it. Children of those children aren't going to be affected by it, but direct children that are directly underneath an element, will be affected. So in order to create a flexible box layout, we actually set a property on the parent container so that elements inside of it will be part of that layout. And the outside is going to be either inline or block level, depending on which way we set it. So this way, if we set, and this div right here, this is just going to be the parent element. And if we set this display property to inline flex, the outside of our container is going to be an inline element, so other elements are going to flow along the side. Well, not going to flow. They're going to be, we're going to be able to have elements positioned beside that element. And if we have a flex, if we just set our display property to flex, then it's going to be block on the outside. So other elements are not going to be on the same line as this element. They're going to be shifted to a new line. But either way, whether we use inline flex or regular flex, it's still going to be flexible box layout on the inside. So items in the normal flow of the document flow left to right, top to bottom. But items in a flex container, we have a lot more control. It's a lot more flexible. So by default, it's going to flow, it's always going to flow along the main axis. And we'll learn about that in just a minute. By default, it's going to be horizontal, but we can also set it to be vertical. And another thing about Flexbox or flexible box layout is that by default, it's all going to be going along that main axis. The more content we place on it, it's still going to go along that main axis. So if we have like 100 elements all within our flex container, they're all going to be sort of squished together because they're not going to go to the next line unless we enable something called wrapping, which we'll do in a little bit. So by default, main axis is going left to right. You can see that here. And in flexible box layout, we have a main axis and then we have a cross axis. And by default, items are going to flow along the main axis. And they'll just keep going and going and going. And they'll only stay on this main axis unless we enable something called wrapping. And we can always shift this. So here by default, you can see that we have 3 boxes inside of the parent container. The parent container is set to display flex. And in this example, we set the flex direction to row. So these elements are displayed in a row, and that's left to right on the main axis. We can even display this in row reverse, and you can see the property over here. And now our boxes are now right to left along the main axis. Now we can also set the flex direction to column, and you can actually see that here. Now our main axis is going top to bottom, cross axis is going left to right, because they sort of flipped. Well, you'll see that main axis is going this way, cross axis this way, and then here they flipped around. One thing to note is that the main axis, the cross axis is always perpendicular to the main axis. That's just one thing to note with flexible box layout. But we can always shift these in different ways. So you'll see right here that we have a column. All these items are aligned in a column. And we can also do that in reverse. So here we have everything in reverse. It goes from bottom to top along the main axis. So they're going to display on one line by default, but we can change that by enabling something called wrapping. And whenever we enable wrapping, it will wrap to the next line, and that will be down the cross-axis. So here you see that we have no wrapping enabled. Flex wrap, the property, is set to the value of no wrap, and that's by default. And you'll see that our boxes are sort of squished together. And if we were to enable this, if we change this no wrap value to wrap, then you'll see that our boxes are no longer sort of squished together. They fit inside of the container, and then they go down to the next line whenever there's not enough room. And another fun thing, we can actually do this in reverse. So here, this is our first element. It goes 1, 2, 3, and then we have 4, 5. So it wraps in reverse. There's not as much use for that, but we can do it if we wanted to. Now, flexible box layout is actually really nice for centering. It's really easy to center things with flexible box layout. But we're not just limited to centering. We can also align it to the left. We can align it to the right. We can align it a bunch of different ways. First, we're going to learn how to center things along the main axis. And we'll do that with an example. So you'll see we have this right here. You can go ahead and type that up if you want. I already have it typed up. But what we have is we have 3 paragraphs and they're sort of styled to look like a box. And they're inside of a container. And that container is going to give these children elements it's going to put them within a flexible box layout, because you see we set the display to flex. And we have another property which corresponds to the flexible box layout. It's called justify content. And we're going to do that to the center. And you'll see the result of that whenever we pull this up. So if I was to go ahead and pull this up in my text editor here, you'll see that I already have this typed up. And you'll see that I set justify content to center. So if we go ahead and save these files, and then we pull this up in the browser, this is what we're going to see. We're going to see that we have our 3 boxes, and when we use the justify content property, it justified it along the main axis. Right now the main axis by default is left to right, and it justified that in the center. So all 3 elements are centered here. So if I have the Chrome developer tools pull up on to the side, and you can always enable those. You can go ahead and pull those up by pressing F12 on your keyboard, or you can just right click and inspect the page. But you can see if I go ahead and scroll along these, if I move my mouse along these elements, you'll see that I have all 3 elements perfectly centered. So back here, you see that here's our browser preview. And we actually have a bunch of different properties that we can set. We can set justify content to center. We can set it to the flex start, which is just going to be the start of the main axis to the end of the main axis. Flex end. We can set space between them. We can set space around. We can space it evenly. And these are just ways of aligning things along the main axis. Whether that main axis is flipped going in the column direction, that's just top to bottom, or if it's going left to right. It's still going to justify it along the main axis. And that's why we don't call it the X and Y axes, is because these axes here, they're going to flip. Sometimes the main axis is this way, sometimes the main axis is this way. Sometimes they flip around, and that's why we call them main and cross rather than X and Y. But anyway, let's go ahead and change this now. So let's set a new property, flex direction, or not a new property, let's set our new property, flex direction, to column. And this time we're going to set justify content to space around. This way we'll just see what all we can do here. So let's go ahead and do that. So I have my Atom text editor pulled up. I already have this typed up. And if I was to go ahead and save this and pull this up in the browser, what I'm going to see is something like this. And you'll see here in our CSS that we set the flex direction to column. So now the main axis is going up, it's going top to bottom. And we set justify content to space around. And that's exactly what happened. Our items are now in a column, and there's now space around each element. It's pretty cool. And this is what it looks like in the browser. And you'll see here that we can align children elements along the cross-axis in addition to the main axis. And this is what's going to allow us to vertically center things perfectly in CSS without any fancy hacks like shifting an element 50% and then transforming it back 50%. Instead, we can finally have vertically centered elements in CSS. So let's go ahead and look at that. We're going to use a new property called align items, and we're going to set that to center. And that's going to align things along the cross axis. And justify content aligns it along the main axis. Align items is going to align it along the cross axis. Main and cross axis. So if we go and pull this up in Atom, that's not Atom. So if we go ahead and pull this up in Atom, and actually let's go ahead and change this to center. Let's go ahead and change this to center, and we'll go ahead and pull this up in a browser. We refresh the page. You'll see that these three elements are aligned perfectly center, horizontally and vertically. And we can set align items to a bunch of different properties. We can set it to center, flex start, flex end. We can even set it to stretch, so it's going to stretch along the cross axis. Now, it's not going to work necessarily if we set the height, but if the height isn't set, then it's going to stretch. Now, there are a bunch of other things that we can do with flexible box layout. We can change the order in which elements are displayed. So you'll see here that we had 1, 2, 3. We can actually change the order. So if we were to select one and we were to change the order, we could change the order of these elements. And you'll see us set 2 to this order. And you'll see that it changes order in the document. But we can change the order. We can align multiple lines of elements. So if we had more than just one line, we could align multiple lines of elements within this container along the cross axis. And we could even shrink and grow elements. We can align specific elements. Even though we aligned all the elements, we can align specific elements in this flex container. And there's a lot we can do, and it would take a lot of time just to go over all the things that we could do in flexible box layout. But I suggest you go check out this website, CSS Tricks, a guide to Flexbox. Just type in Google CSS Tricks Flexbox, and you'll probably find this website right here. And it's a great guide that will sort of guide you through everything. So let's go ahead and move on to making responsive websites. Now we can make a website responsive, and there's a few different ways that we can do that. And the reason we make websites responsive is because people could be viewing our website on a phone, a tablet, large monitor. They could be viewing it on any size device, and our website needs to be able to scale for these sizes, so whoever's viewing our website will have a better experience, and they won't want to leave as soon. So one way of making it sort of responsive is by using percentages. And another way is going to be to use minimum and maximum widths, which we'll go over. And the last way is going to be using media queries. First, we'll go over percentages. You'll remember that on Monday we went over a basic website template. And in doing so, we set different percentages for the left and right sides of this website. And I actually have the website pulled up right here. You'll see that we actually set this side, if we were to inspect this is 70% on the side here. And this other side is 30%. And we actually see the CSS right here. We set the width to 70% and we set the width to 30% on the side. And these both equal 100%. And that means that since we set these two percentages, whenever we scale the website down, our website's going to shrink, and it's going to look a lot better on a mobile phone. Maybe not so well on a mobile phone, but it will look better on like a tablet maybe, if we were to shrink this down just a little bit. If we were to shrink this down anymore, we'd have a little problem because things would look a little scrunched together. And we'll learn how to fix that here in a little bit. But we won't necessarily be able to do that with percentages. We're going to have to learn something new, and that's where media queries come in. But first we're going to go over minimum and maximum width and height. So we can set a minimum and maximum width, and we can set a minimum and maximum height. It's more common to use widths because that's what we're worried about. Documents are sort of one-dimensional in the way that we lay them out. We sort of align content left to right, and then elements just sort of flow down. That's how we usually work with documents. And it's more common to use minimum and maximum widths, but we can do that with heights as well. So best way to see this is with an example. So go ahead and type this up. I actually already have it typed up here. And I'll go ahead and pull that up actually. So yeah, that's actually this one right here. and I'll go and close out some of these files. So you'll see that we actually have this right here. If I was to pull this up in the browser, and you'll see here, this is 900 pixels, this is a little smaller than 900 pixels, and this is much less than 500 pixels, and that's why it's not really centered. This last one here is a lie, it's not really centered. Because there's still content over here, sort of overflowing, that we have to scroll over to see. Now, that's minimum and maximum width and height, but this is where our website becomes a lot more responsive when we start using media queries, because we can actually target different types of screen sizes, and then we can create different CSS rules that apply only whenever a device is such width or such height. So you see here, I just have 3 little example devices. We have like an S8, iPad mini, and just a laptop. I think it's a Dell XPS laptop. So let's go ahead and talk about the syntax of this. How do we use a media query? So this is our basic syntax for internal and external style sheets. And this is how we would select everything on the page regardless of screen size. So how do we only select elements if we want to use a certain device? This is where we introduce a new @ rule. And you'll see that an @ rule is just prefixed with an @ symbol. It's prefixed with this symbol right here. And then we have our rule, and our rule is going to be media in this case. And in this case, this is going to tell the browser when to display certain types of CSS. Our @ rule is sort of going to be like a rule for the browser to follow. So we have our media, and then we have our media type, media feature, and then our CSS is going to go inside of these curly braces. So our media type is going to be what device our CSS should sort of render to. And the most common types are going to be screen and print. So we could set it to be the screen, which is ideally what we're going to be using whenever we're creating a website. But we can also set it to print. So if we want only styles that are going to be set whenever we're going to print a page out, we can actually do that. And we can set specific styles for whenever this page is printed out on a page, which is pretty cool. And then we have our media feature. So we want our media to be, we'll pretend this is a screen, and we want it to have a certain feature. And that feature can be a bunch of different things. It could be a browser size, the device orientation, whether the display device has the ability to show color. It could be a lot of different things. And one thing to note about this is it's always enclosed in parentheses. So just don't forget the parentheses there. All media features are going to be inside parentheses. And then all of our CSS goes inside these curly braces. So inside this block, which is just the curly brace, whatever goes inside the curly brace, and then the ending curly brace, we're going to put all of our CSS. So we can have, right here we only have one selector and one block, but we can have multiple selectors. We can change a bunch of different things inside this, this rule. So let's go ahead and look at an example. So we have our media rule, our @ rule, media, and we're going to only display the CSS whenever the device is a screen, and the maximum width is 414 pixels. So if the browser width is any larger than 414 pixels, then it's not going to apply. But if it's any less than 414 pixels, then this will apply. And I use 414 because that's the width of a browser window inside of Safari using device pixels, but we'll talk more about that actually right now. So we'll talk a little bit about that actually right now. So a physical pixel is not the same as a pixel in CSS, and this is sort of a complicated, somewhat complicated idea, especially if we don't really have any knowledge of, if we don't really know too much about web development. It's not too difficult, but at first glance it can seem a little bit more difficult than it needs to be. But the browser will set the viewport, what we're actually seeing in our browser window, to somewhere between 800 through 1024 pixels on mobile devices. So if we have a website and we display it in the browser, it's going to give a viewport width of, we'll pretend that this is like 900 pixels. It may not be. It may be larger, it may be smaller, but we'll just pretend it's 900. And if we have say a 450, a block on the page that's 450 pixels in width, it's going to display from the left side to the center, not accounting for margins of the body and things, but that's beside the point. It's going to display basically from the left to the center, and that's going to be our block right there. And that's by default, because in physical pixels, say on the S8, this is the Galaxy S8 right here, we would actually have 1,440 pixels. But device-independent pixels, we would have 360. Also, we can call these software pixels. We would actually have only 360 there. So we can actually change this to 360 device-independent pixels by using a meta tag. And right here is actually that tag right here. So this was originally something that Apple introduced a while back, and we use it for a lot of things whenever it comes to mobile phones now. And this is the most common one. We set the width to equal the device width, and that's in software pixels. So it would be set on the Galaxy S8, it would be set to 360 pixels rather than the physical size of 1440. It would be set to device-independent pixels instead whenever we set the width to device width. And then the initial scale is going to be set to 1. So setting this initial scale is going to make sure that whenever we rotate the device, whether it's in portrait or landscape orientation, it's still going to take the device width or the device height if we rotate the device around. And that's going to set the viewport. And we can actually find a list of dimensions for various phones because there's no way we could remember them all by going to this website, material.io/devices. And I believe I actually already have that pulled up here. So you'll see that we actually have a bunch of different devices that we can look at here. So for instance, the iPhone 6 Plus is a popular one. So you see it's set to 414 device pixels or device-independent pixels, 414, and that's the one we used earlier, and that's the width, and then the height is 736. So if we were to rotate the device to landscape mode, it would be 736 pixels for the width of the browser. And the reason we use software pixels is because our screens, our mobile phones, there's so many pixels, it's so dense that if we were to... Another good way to think about it is our desktop monitors usually have widths of, I can't think of the size right now, but like, let's say it's like 1600 by 900, for example. There's a few monitors like that. Most of them are larger, but say if that was our monitor size, those screens are much bigger, and yet this device, this small little device, has all those pixels crammed and more pixels crammed into just the width of this phone, even though the height is even much larger than that. So if we were to display everything on a monitor on the smaller screen, it would sort of be very, very small because the pixels are so dense, they're so tightly packed together. This is a 4K screen, the Galaxy S8 Plus is. So we use these device-independent pixels. So this is set to 360, so it's going to look much nicer compared to whenever we compare this with a monitor. They're going to be roughly around the same size. It's going to look a lot nicer. And that's why we use that. There's still a little bit more to know about software pixels, but we don't have to go over that necessarily. You can just find the pixels there for whatever device you're using. You can find the screen density and the width in software pixels using this website right here. But that's just a quick tip about software pixels. Anyway, let's go ahead and get back to what we were talking about, media queries. That's what we were originally talking about. And whenever we set the maximum width to 414, if we use this tag right here, then that's going to set our width to the device width. So on an iPhone, that would be 414 pixels across. So this media query is going to make more sense whenever we have a viewport set. So a good rule is to always use this meta tag right here. Always set this in your HTML document. Actually, whenever you create an HTML template, always drop this in there because we always want to use this because we want to be able to support mobile devices. Most people are going to view a website on their mobile phone, most likely. So it's a good idea to set this. Always set this. Anyway, going back to media queries. Let's talk about media queries with an example. So First, we're not going to use media queries. And you'll see that we set our viewport right here. We set the viewport so that the width is equal to the device width, initial scale is equal to 1. So we're not using media queries yet. We're not going to use it just yet. So let's go and make sure we save this, and then let's go ahead and open this up in the browser. You'll see that we have 3 icons, or we'll call these icons. They're actually just dividers, and we set a border radius. And you'll see here that we have 3 of these circles, and then underneath we have different text. And we see this a lot in different websites. We usually have like an icon here, and then we have some text describing the cool feature. You see that we just have cool, and that's sufficient for what I'm trying to demonstrate here. So you'll see that we have that set. We just center the text as well, and you'll see that we're using our flex again. We're using our flex property. So our grid container, which is containing all 3 of these dividers, containing all of our little icon placeholders, and containing all our text. This grid container is set to be a flex. Our display property is set to flex, so everything inside it, direct children, which is this divider, if you can see my mouse here, this divider, and this divider, all direct children are going to be affected by that. So we justify content by spacing it evenly, and then we align items to the flex start. And we actually don't even have to set this, that's just going to happen by default. So if I can go and even just erase that if I wanted to, and I can save this, and I can pull it up in the browser. And if I was to refresh the page, it's already aligned to the start. And we justify content, so there's space in between all these. But anyway, I'll go and keep it there. We don't actually need it, but we'll go and keep it there anyway. But this is what we have here, and it looks pretty good. It looks pretty nice. But whenever we scale down to mobile devices, it's going to not look so nice. So here we have it on a tablet screen on an iPad mini, and it looks nice. On a mobile phone, it looks a little condensed, but we can fix that with media queries. So we can use our media queries here. We're going to set the maximum width to 414 pixels, and we're going to only display that on screens. So if this is being displayed on a screen and the maximum width is 414 pixels, the viewport, the area in which we're viewing here, is at maximum 414 pixels, then it's going to use whatever rule is inside. So in this case, we selected our grid container again. So we actually selected it here originally, but we're going to add a media query in. And so now we selected this here, but this no longer applies. Whenever the screen has a maximum width of 414 pixels, this rule applies. You'll see we use the exact same selector right here. These two are the same, but this one right here is more specific. It's targeting devices that have a maximum width of 414 pixels, or a browser window that has a maximum of 414 pixels. So whenever that is the case, this rule is going to apply. Whatever isn't set in this rule, that is set by this one's going to be applied. So we didn't set the display property, so that display property would be this one. So right here we have set the flex direction to column, and that's actually this one. By default, the flex direction is set to row, and we're going to change this instead to column. So we want these items to, instead of being aligned in a row, we want to align them in a column for mobile devices. And we set justify content to flex start, because if we set this to a column, the main axis is going to top to bottom. So we want to justify content along the start. And that's not really the most important thing here. The most important thing here is that we align items to the center. So the cross axis is actually going, this way now. It's going left to right instead. Instead of going top to bottom, it's going left to right. And it's better if we actually just see this in action. So if we were to go ahead and open up Atom, and we save this right here, pull it up in a browser, and if we were to shrink this window down, shrink it down a lot, you see that now it looks like this instead. It looks much nicer on mobile, but it still looks great on mobile on larger screens. Because if we were to enlarge this again, it would still look great on larger screens, because where this rule no longer applies, this rule, all of our declarations here, these now apply. And that's basically media queries. And that's basically all that I have to talk about today. But I do want to show you one cool little thing. And you don't have to know this. This is not anything that you actually have to know, but it's just something that is pretty cool that you should probably check out. If you've ever heard of Emmet, it's something you can download for your text editor, and it helps you create HTML much faster using this sort of pseudo CSS syntax to write HTML. And the best way to describe it is actually just to look at it. So you'll see here that this is what we typed before, and you'll see some sort of what this creates here. So we typed this, something really short, and it turned into this, which is pretty cool. So we just typed 3 exclamation points. That said our document preamble or document type declaration. We said plus HTML. So on our next line, we type HTML, and this greater than sign says that the HTML is greater than the body, or the body is supposed to be placed inside of HTML. It's the direct descendant of this body is the direct descendant of HTML. So you'll see that we have a body inside of an HTML element. And then we have a paragraph inside of the HTML element. And we use these curly braces set to the text, which is easy as. And then we use plus to go to the next line. We make an unordered list. And inside of an unordered list is list items. And then we multiply that by 3. So we have 3 list items inside. And this $sign is just going to set the number. So the first one is 1, then 2, then 3. That's what this little $sign is here for. And again, you don't have to know this. It's just really cool. Had to share it. It's really cool. And you can always check out all of the possibilities here by checking out the Emmet website. And I have that pulled up here as well. There's actually a cheat sheet that you can use. Actually, it's right here. And it will tell you all about the different abbreviations that you can do, that you can type, and then you can actually expand this. And the expansion is going to be different in different text editors. You can use Control-Alt-Enter, I believe, in Atom, maybe different in other text editors, but you can use any of these abbreviations to write longer HTML. It's really neat. Something worth checking out. But that's all for day 7. I'll see you on day 8.